my title, Rereading the Best Gospel, is not, I'm not going to ask you what your favorite gospel is. I would be happy to know which one it is, but I plan to tell you which one is the best gospel, to sort of make objective claims on that score. And I just tried to think about why I chose this topic and proposed this topic. I suppose it might be influenced a little bit by the fact that the Sabbath School quarterly, this quarter, we have been studying the Gospel of Mark, and next quarter we are going to do the Gospel of John, and there will be, I will say, quite a bit about the Gospel of John in this presentation. I have been teaching a course on the Gospel of John at Loma Linda, and that is the Gospel that I have been, what to the extent I have written anything about the Gospels, I have mostly written about the Gospel of John. And one more reason why I thought about this is because I am not extremely, I don't want to be negative, but I just find it strange that Adventist scholars, when they are asked to do the Sabbath School quarterly, do not let Adventists see the kind of conversation that goes on in the academic community. How is it possible for us to go about, business as usual? Let's say that we are studying texts that are familiar, and there is a certain risk that familiarity breeds contempt. So we need to overcome the contempt factor. And I am very disappointed that I do not see that kind of effort made in the way we present these Gospels to the wider Adventist community. So I would like to update us a little on Gospel studies here, and then see where this takes us in relation to which Gospel is the best one. So the illustration I have on the right-hand side here is Michelangelo. This is a very rough sketch that I will return to and comment on a little later. The figure in the middle is Jesus, who has died and who is sinking into the earth. And the painting is called Lamentations. Okay, the best gospel. Which one is the best? And I will begin by referring to this book by Richard Burridge, who I have met and who I think is an extremely nice person and a very capable New Testament scholar. And his book was published maybe 25 years ago. It has gone through several editions, and it's a wonderful book, a kind of must-read book, I would say, in gospel studies today, because it seeks to restore to each of the gospels their individuality. He calls it a symbolic reading. And there is another one similar to it by Martin Hengel, but not quite as engaging or useful, in my view, as Richard Burridge's book, for the four Gospels and the one Gospel of Jesus Christ. I think Martin Hengel tries to homogenize, whereas Burridge tries to differentiate. And anyway, both of them, I have both books, and I have used Burridge's book in my teaching, and I know other Adventist colleagues, at least a few, at least one, who uses Burridge's book in her gospel teaching. So the symbolic reading that Burridge is trying to exploit has to do with the way the Gospels have been symbolized in the Christian tradition for centuries, going way, way back, where each gospel was given a figure that was seen to, in some ways, to express or to be a fitting symbol for the main emphasis in the gospel. So here is one. There is the Gospel of Mark, and the symbol for Mark is the lion. And to what extent does Mark have characteristics resembling a lion? And then there is Matthew. The human being is the symbol for Matthew, going way back. The illustration I have here is 1,000 years old, iconography that is that old. Then there is the Gospel of Luke with an ox. And why is that? You know, the ox as a beast of burden or as a sacrificial animal, some associations like that might work. And then there is the Gospel of John and the eagle. And I have seen an amazing use of these symbols that I'd like to show you. So here is from my own travels, or our own travels, a year ago or 2 years ago to Italy. Here we are in Ravenna, and this is the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna. And Ravenna is famous mostly for being a very important transition place in Roman imperial times, and in the 5th and 6th century. So we're going to go inside, and this is what it looks like inside. And this building or church was built in early 6th century. So we are around 550 or so. And we're looking at a hexagonal building. And we are looking at one of the walls, and I will enlarge it so you can see it here. And you can see that this is mosaic, and it is exquisite. And it has been extremely well preserved, and you will agree that it is difficult to give figures, to make them expressive when they are made in mosaic. But here, these figures are very expressive, and there is a lot of Bible story told through these figures. You can see at the bottom of the screen now, there is a figure, a table, and there is Abel and Melchizedek juxtaposed there at the table. And there is Isaiah, and there is Moses, but I'm going to enlarge it a little more. And let's see here, to the top of this tableau here. So here you will see our gospel figures. Here you will see Matthew with the human being, and you will see Mark here with the lion, and we see Luke with the ox, and we see John with the eagle. And I'm sorry that the figures at the bottom, I couldn't get high enough resolution, and the light was not so good, but I think you can see that these are pretty exquisite illustrations and a way of representing the Gospels that goes way, way back, and that in Richard Burridge's scholarship is given explanatory significance or pedagogical significance, as it were, because of characteristics coming from each of these Gospels. Now, my question, which one is the best gospel, is not a question that people ask, and certainly scholars tend not to ask that question. You might say that if there is a sequence or an order, sort of chronological order in which these Gospels were produced, and that the second author knows about the first one, then you can say that they are motivated the way most of us are motivated when we set out to write something that other people have written about before. That is to say, we want to improve it, or we think we can add to it at least. So, but that is not really how gospel research has proceeded. We have not asked which is the best gospel. We have asked which is the first one. So, which one is the first gospel? And that has not returned an answer that, oh, the first one was the best one necessarily. But that has been a preoccupation for a couple of 100 years at least, or even more, or even going back to the earliest days in the Christian history, because there have been theories about which gospel is the oldest one from at least 4th century, maybe even before. So, which one is the first? Well, most of us have heard that Mark is the oldest one, and there is this notion of a Markan priority in gospel studies. So Mark is the first gospel, and after that is Matthew and Luke, and they are very similar to Mark, especially Matthew, so they must have used Mark when they wrote their books. And then this has been complicated a little by representing it like this, because here there is a direct line from Mark to Luke, and there is a direct line from Mark to Matthew, but there is also a line from Luke to Matthew. So here there is this gospel, the theory that there is an influence from more than one source on the gospels written after Mark was written. And this one, you have probably had presenters who have talked to you about a two-source hypothesis of in gospel studies in the synoptic gospels. There is Mark, again, influencing Matthew here, and Luke. And then there is another gospel, the manuscript evidence for which we don't have, but it can be assumed. And that's the Q source. So Mark and Q are influencing Matthew and especially Luke. And the Q hypothesis has gotten so much traction, or has emerged as a strong alternative, you might say, or a strong hypothesis, enough so that some scholars have reconstructed a Q manuscript, as it were, that was strong enough to make it to become one of the volumes in the Hermeneia series of Bible commentaries. Well, there is a case against Q. So here is Mark Goodacre, who is a very prominent New Testament scholar, now teaching at Duke University, and I have had interacted a little with him because he accepted my doctoral dissertation for publication in one of the New Testament dissertation series. So I am very happy for my encounters with him. But he has written a book this one was published in 2002, that basically says that everything we claim to, or everything we attribute to a hypothetical Q source, can be explained otherwise. So the tide has kind of turned, and that Q hypothesis isn't any longer as viable as it used to be. And now the 20 years that have gone since Goodacre published his book has not totally rescued that Q hypothesis, even though it is still held. So I would like to just digress a little before I start in on saying something about the Gospel of John, because so far I've just talked about the synoptics. So a thought about discipleship and text transmission, because it's very prominent, especially in the synoptics, that Jesus recruited disciples deliberately, that this was a major thing in his project. And you can read it here. We read it here from Mark. He went up to the mountain and called to him those whom he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, to be with him and to be sent out to proclaim the message and to have authority to cast out demons. So here you have a statement, and you find it in all the synoptics, that Jesus did recruit disciples. And from a large pool of potential trainees, he selected 12 for special training. And this is where it says to be with him, to be with him 24/7. That's how most of us have read it. And you might wonder what were his selection criteria. And we might wonder what the training program was all about. What was it? But there is a notion of trainees and the notion of a training program here. And whether in the synoptic witness or in John, we see purpose at work. So Jesus isn't just an accidental figure and who became famous or who that we know about for accidental reasons. There seems to have been a structure to it and an intention on his part. So here is another book I mentioned. First, I mentioned the book by Richard Burridge and recommended it. This one is a little heavier read, but it has become somewhat of a classic. It was published first time in the 1960s, and it has been reprinted and is now highly, highly regarded. So this is a book now in the Biblical Resource series, Memory and Manuscript, Tradition and Transmission in Early Christianity. And this is written by a Swedish scholar by the name of Birger Gerhardsson. So how did mentoring, how was it done? Because he talks about ancient mentoring practices and extrapolates that those practices may in fact have explanatory value for the way Jesus carried out his mentorship. And so what did they do? Well, they memorized stuff. And then there was learning and understanding. Also, you weren't just memorizing by rote. There was text and there was commentary. And there was an emphasis on avoiding wordiness and vacuity. So it was a kind of disciplined way of doing things. And there were didactic and poetic devices, ways to do this better, ways to make your point, bring your point across. And there was an emphasis on repetition. Already in those days, repetition was the mother of learning. There isn't much learning like that going on anymore, but those ancient practices are significant to the way Gerhardsson thinks about the Gospels. And then there was recitation. So you heard it repeated, and then you recited it, you performed it, you shared it. And these so far are all are mostly oral. So this is an oral culture, an oral transmission culture that we are talking about here. But this oral transmission culture will eventually make it into print. And so the memories will become manuscripts. That is what Gerhardsson was saying. And this was quite revolutionary in gospel studies at the time. So, and again, at the last one, an emphasis on comprehension and struggle against lifeless knowledge. So in my teaching, I have compared it to medical training, that Jesus in some ways is doing exactly what William Osler did, who is known as the father of modern medical training. And I have done that kind of training too, and have benefited from wonderful mentors at at Loma Linda University. So what did Osler do? Well, residents, not unlike the training envisioned in or I'm talking about Jesus and William Osler both here, not unlike the training envisioned in the 19th century by Sir William Osler, the father of modern medicine. Why are they called residents? Why are they called house staff? It's because you actually lived in the hospital and you spend time with your mentors. And we notice that Mark says that Jesus chose disciples to be with him. So there is a similarity here. And in medicine, we have had this saying that you see one, and then you do one, and then you teach one. That there is that built-in dynamic in acquiring skills, that you don't just watch it, you do it, and then you teach it to someone else. And maybe you can infer that kind of dynamic for the disciples. And then what's the goal? What are you aiming for? Well, you're aiming for acquiring the ability to perform in the absence of the mentor. If you are a surgical resident, one day you will be the one who is the most expert on the case, and you have to be able to perform with no mentor present. And so I am hinting that Jesus had similar goals, and that there is a transmission path then from being a disciple, spending time with Jesus, and acquiring, learning the message, as it were, and being able to share it and share it faithfully. And that could be a factor that vouches for the quality of the Gospels available to us. That was a digression. Now, here is just one more illustration. And you see that there is a foreword for this book by Mark Goodacre, so he probably agrees with the content. This book is not out yet. It will be published in 2025, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. And this one includes then the relationship between the Gospel of John and the synoptic tradition. Okay. What about the fourth gospel? Because that is the line of demarcation that we have. We talk about the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then there is the fourth gospel. And why is it the fourth? Well, because that has been sort of built into our thinking about the Gospels, that it is the last one to be written. The other ones are earlier. And maybe that is true, maybe it isn't entirely provable. So I'd like us to look now at some things in the fourth Gospel. And here too, even though in biblical scholarship, those who do synoptic gospel studies and those who do Johannine studies, they are not interacting very much. There is a Johannine scholarly community and there is a synoptic scholarly community. I will not say that never the twain shall meet, but they do not interact that much. And this book was published in 1968 by J. Lewis Martin, who, in my view, is one of the most spectacular New Testament scholars of that time. He died in 2015, I believe, 2015 or 2016. I have met him, I have shook his hand, and he has had an impact, a huge impact on Johannine studies, and also a huge impact on Pauline studies, on understanding of the letters of Paul. So he has been in two arenas. But this book seems to me one should make people aware of it, and we should see what to do with it. You cannot avoid it. If you want to do serious work on the Gospel of John, you cannot avoid or bypass J. Lewis Martin's book, History and Theology in the Fourth Gospel. And there is many others that are similar or have similar tendencies, talking about the community of the beloved disciple. This is Raymond Brown, who's a Catholic Johannine scholar, has written a 2-volume commentary on John, and who was a good friend of J. Lewis Martin. So what do they say? What is the story here in Johannine studies beginning before the 1960s? It's older than that, but it was formulated more succinctly by these people. So here is what they said, that the Gospel of John is less the story of Jesus than it is the story of the Johannine community. So there is an element of Jesus in the Gospel of John, but there is also a story of the Johannine community after the time of Jesus. So to compare it, you might say that this resembles the relation. I'm sorry. That this resembles the relationship between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. I don't know what happened.
Take your time.
Yeah, so in Luke, Acts, we have Luke, the Gospel of Luke, as a story about Jesus. And then we have the book of Acts, also attributed to Luke, as the story of the believing community, the story of what happened after the time of Jesus. But in Lou Martin's model for understanding John, you have these two stories sort of baked into one. There is an element of the story of Jesus, and there is a huge element of the community to which Jesus gave birth. And another element in this view is that this community had a sectarian character, and it was at the periphery of the Christian movement. And the gospel then describes the trials of the community and not simply the life of Jesus. Specifically, the gospel describes the plight of Jewish believers in Jesus, the Johannine community, and its separation from the synagogue in the late first century. And the main textual substrate on which Lou Martin built that view is the chapter 9 in the Gospel of John, the Sabbath healing and of the man who was born blind. So, and it is a really big tour de force, a remarkable composition, and just the cleverness of the whole thing just took the Johannine community scholars by storm. And 50 years after this book was published, there was a special session at the Society of Biblical Literature devoted to it. Now, it has been critiqued, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to show it by way of an illustration here. What you see here is a one-story house, and here I play on the word story as in a house, one-story house, and story as in a story or an account. So here is one story and a one-story house, or one level house and one story. And this is then the story of Jesus. in the Johannine community hypothesis, we have a two-story house. So here is a two-story house, and here on the first floor you have Jesus, the story of Jesus, and on the second floor you have the Johannine community. And then when you read the Gospel of John with the two-level hypothesis in mind, you need to sift out and figure out how much of this or what is attributable to the experience of the Johannine community and what is primary, that is to say, the story of Jesus. So this has had a huge influence in Johannine studies. Now, I want to look at some text in the Gospel of John, and then we see if we can make a few conclusions and have a conversation about that. So I'm beginning here reading in at the ending of the Gospel of John, and in chapter 21. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And you see the Sea of Tiberias, and it is almost in the news every day now because of the war between various warring parties in the Middle East. And the north of Galilee has been depopulated to some extent. So Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. So here we see that most of the characters that are present at the ending of the story were present at the beginning. Whether you read the Synoptics or the Gospel of John, these characters appear very early on in the Gospels. And then, just as an assumption, that the story in this Gospel is aware of the story told in the three Synoptic Gospels, whether whether that awareness is direct or exactly how it works. But there is that idea now in gospel studies that the Gospel of John does have some awareness of the Synoptics. So I'm reading on now. Peter turned and saw the disciples whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me." So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but, "If it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you?" And here we have this character at the end of the gospel called the disciple whom Jesus loved. So that is intriguing. Why is there such a figure? What does it mean? How did such a concept emerge? And then we read on, this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. And we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Now, we need to do this slowly, and we need to do this with all due attention. So, voices in the fourth gospel. There is a he, and that is even more clear from the text on that I referred to already. But there is a his and a him and a he, and that figure is called the beloved disciple. And by the way, to those of you who think that the beloved disciple is John, the son of Zebedee, that is never said outrightly in the Gospel of John, and he is not the only candidate. There is a he here, and there is a we. So someone is talking back. Someone is represented in the text as a we. And this is completely unlike anything you find in the synoptics. And sure enough, there is an I. I suppose that the world itself. And that I is not the beloved disciple. That is someone other than the beloved disciple. So there is a he and a we and an I here at the ending of the disciple to make things, to make us privy or to make us present in a sort of point of origin of this gospel that is very intriguing and completely unique to this gospel. So there is then in the gospel itself the claim that these people were present when it happened. This is the one who is testifying these things and who has written them. The claim of an eyewitness account or eyewitness testimony. So let's walk back in the story about these things, and I think I can go on a few more minutes. So here we go back to the Last Supper that is told in over 4 chapters in the Gospel of John, starting in chapter 13. So after saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Very truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him and to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" So there he is again, that figure that is mentioned and singled out at the ending of the gospel here at the supper. And this is the first time he's mentioned in John. And the Last Supper is a pivotal event, and the beloved disciple is there. And he is close to Jesus. He is ento kolpo to Jesu. That term is also used for the relationship between Jesus and the Father. He is in the bosom of the Father. And this person acts as a go-between in relation to Peter. Okay, at the cross, and by the way, the illustration I had here is Duccio from Siena. And here we go on, and this is El Greco on the crucifixion. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. And again, here we have the disciple whom Jesus loved or whom he loved. And so at this second mention, he is there. And the significance is obvious because we are at the cross, a pivotal event. And the beloved disciple is there as the one only named male figure, and 3 or 4 women with him. And that is quite unique for this gospel. And that the beloved disciple will be like a son to Jesus' mother. So we go to the resurrection. And early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Why does it talk like that? And said to him, and I will skip the rest of the story. Just skip ahead a little. And then they run to the tomb, and let's see here. Yeah, the 2 of them were running to the tomb, and Peter and the beloved disciple reaches first, and then he Simon Peter comes and so on, and then the disciple whom Jesus loved goes in, and he saw and believed. And I wish we could do these texts in much more detail, because there is something intriguing detail on every count here. But this is the third mention of the disciple whom Jesus loved. The significance is obvious. We are at the tomb, and the other disciple outran Peter because he is younger than Peter, and at that time he was more fit, and maybe at that time a young man. And he saw like Peter, but he saw and believed. So in relation to believing, he is one step ahead of Peter. And then we are at the lake, and Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. Again, the beloved disciple. And here is the fourth mention of the disciple whom Jesus loved, and obvious significance. There is a kind of departure or coming departure of Jesus, and there is a recommission. And it's very intriguing in relation to the beginning of the story too. And the beloved disciple is a seeing person because he is the one who recognizes Jesus. And then the final mention, and I read this text already, the farewell scene at the lake. And we have the disciple whom Jesus loved here too. And this is the fifth mention of the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this is such a prominent feature that it must mean something, and it should not be bypassed as just trivia. So the event is obviously significant because there is departure and a new beginning. And then the claim in the text that this is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them. So let me try to pull these things together, and then I will end my part before we interact. So the Johannine hypothesis, the two-level hypothesis that is postulated by J. Lou Martin, creates quite a lot of distance. It makes Jesus a more remote figure. And there has been a strong pushback against that, and one of the leading voices pushing back against that Johannine community hypothesis is Richard Bauckham, who was one of my mentors at the University of St. Andrews, and I consider him a friend, and I'm happy to be still in touch with him. And I hosted him at Loma Linda some years ago. He came there to share some things. He is highly, highly regarded in Anglo theology and in New Testament circles. In my view, he is the leading New Testament scholar in the UK. Now he's retired, but he has written these significant books that you can see the titles of here. And all the books Richard Bauckham has written have been hugely influential. Here is what he says. We have argued that the Gospels put us in close touch with the eyewitnesses of the history of Jesus. The Gospel writers, in their different ways, present their Gospels as based on and incorporating the testimony of the eyewitnesses. In one case, we have argued, an eyewitness has authored his own Gospel. And it is notable that precisely this Gospel, John's, is the one that incorporates the most extensive reflection on the significance of the eyewitness testimony. So you might think, oh, Richard Bauckham must be one of those people who believe that John, the son of Zebedee, is the beloved disciple, but he doesn't think so, and I leave that for another time. So I think I need to skip some of my slides here and just go ahead.
We have time, Dr. Tonstad. Do all your slides.
Well, okay. I'll please say now this is enough then. So let's see.
Okay.
I'll share a few more slides to sort of fill you in. So one of the books that started a reset was John Robinson's book, The Priority of John. Now that is a play on how gospel criticism has the terminology of gospel criticism, because scholars have always talked about the priority of Markan priority in gospel studies. So for A.T. John Robinson to publish this book on the priority of John, that was quite shocking. This book was published a couple of years after he died, sadly. And John Robinson here is the famous John Robinson who wrote a book called Honest to God. That was a huge book in the 60s and 70s. So, but this is what John Robinson says about in his studies of John. So our testing of the teaching material has again suggested that there is no necessary absurdity or contradiction in asserting that the Johannine presentation could be both the most mature and the most faithful to the original truth about Jesus. So this is a reversal in some ways, and bringing the Gospel of John back as an essential element in creating an account of the historical Jesus. So here is one more. This is also playing on words. You see this book by Jörg Frey, who is one of the leading Johannine scholars now. He is a professor in Zurich. And these books, I think, have been translated. So his book is called Theology and History in the Fourth Gospel. I call this a reset. So this is what Jörg Frey says. There are indeed two levels in John's narration of the Jesus story. The level of the narrated story of the earthly Jesus and the level of narration of the author telling his story to his readers and hearers. It is widely accepted that the Johannine narrative is shaped by insights, challenges, and theological terms from the context of the community of addressees. It is also quite likely that some of the elements in the Johannine narration are inspired by experiences from the time of Jesus to the composition of the gospel. So this is an attempt to pull things together and to walk back some of the claims made by the two-level hypothesis of Lou Martin. So here you have time, and you have the original story here from the days of John the Baptist and the time of Jesus, and then you have the passage of time. And this one I will skip, and I will come back to you a few months from now and share it if we get the time for that. But so here is how I wish to put this together. So there is a revealer in the Gospel of John, Jesus. And there is a special disciple that is sort of demarcated throughout the story, the beloved disciple. And then there is a community. So I was, in my own studies, kind of tempted to discount the community and to think that was a contaminant. But I have changed my mind. So I think these three elements are very important: the revealer, the beloved disciple, and a community. And you can see here then Jesus and beloved disciple and community. And this one I can also skip. So I will say how I would like the timeline construct to look. before we start talking. So that story in the Gospel of John gives us what Jesus said and did, as told by the beloved disciple, at the time when the beloved disciple is about to die or has died. A person who was with Jesus from the beginning, and thus a first-hand witness, eyewitness, to the story remembered and written many years later. Because when the story began in the days of Jesus, the beloved disciple was a young person. And the time when he writes it or engages in having it written down, he is an old man. And that is sort of embedded in the story, the disciple whom Jesus loved and the community. So there is a revealer here, Jesus, who is the main subject. And I have looked at the Sabbath school lessons for this quarter to see if there is even a kind of awareness or a willingness to acknowledge some of the emphases that you have in Johannine studies, such as the one of Jesus as the revealer. And I just wonder if that is going to pan out. But in the story, there is a revealer who is Jesus, who is the main subject. There are disciples, one of whom is called the beloved disciple. He is pictured as an eyewitness and as the source and actual writer of the gospel. And there is a community brought into existence by the witness of the beloved disciple, but also directly and indirectly created by Jesus' own testimony. And this figure, the beloved disciple, he is beloved by Jesus, but he is also a beloved figure by the community, and thus the designation, the beloved disciple. And I have thought about this, and I hope, God willing, I will live some more years, and I would like to write a book about the Gospel of John under the title Revelation and Community in the Fourth Gospel. And then in closing, I would like to say, so why should, of course, I say this tongue in cheek. I'm not wishing to become, to pick a fight with anyone. But so if I now say, oh, this is the best gospel, I'm not just going to say it because it is the gospel that has the strongest element of eyewitness testimony. And I am not saying it either because the notion of Jesus as the revealer of the kind of person God is, that is such a big emphasis in the Gospel of John. That would be a very good reason to call it a very good gospel, if not the very best of the Gospels. But I will make the claim because in the Adventist community today, the biggest Achilles heel is the absence of community, in my view, that the sort of weakness of community. And here in this illustration by Michelangelo, you have Jesus and you have all kinds of figures surrounding him. It's the Johannine community or the Jesus community that are present as he sinks into the earth in his limp body. There are at least 3 or 4 women, and all of them, all the 13 figures that are so tightly entwined with each other, and that all seem to have skin contact with Jesus, they represent a picture of community. And in some ways, I think this is the best gospel right now because it has such a vision of community that is in so much in demand. So Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tonstad. This is the time when people raise their hands. You could do that by clicking the raise hand icon. I see Lauren is up, and I'm hoping all of you will not let Lauren take this whole time. I don't see your hands, but that's where we're going if nobody raises their hand. So Lauren, go ahead. I know you're already unmuted. So
I'm not going to ask who the beloved disciple was, because I'm going to leave that to Janet. She asked it in the chat, and she says, well, maybe we're not supposed to know. And that's okay if we can't know. But I'm going to say something else, Dr. Tonstad. This is so different from the way John was taught to me when I was a student. When I was a student, they taught us that John was a very late gospel, that it was written by somewhere in the 300s, even as late as that. That the people who wrote it had never laid eyes on Jesus and probably copied some of the original earlier three gospels. That the earlier the gospel was written down, the more accurate it was likely to be. And by the time you got into the 300s, sometimes there probably was just stories that people were telling. I mean, that's how they talked about it back then. And I find it so interesting now that you're saying that this was a more accurate gospel. How could it be more accurate if it was written so late, or maybe it wasn't? Help me to understand what's going on there. Another thing that I remember mentioning, they would talk about some of the figures that only John used to a great extent, like the light and the dark, and in the beginning was the Word, and these metaphors that they said, well, those metaphors only originated later on in the history of Christianity. They weren't original with the original Christian thinkers. You don't find them in the other Gospels to that extent. You don't find them in Acts. You don't find Paul talking about them. That's another thing I remember. So you're stretching my mind here. Straighten me out if you can.
Well, yes, it has, these claims. So this is not, please do not understand this as a kind of battle between liberals and conservatives. This is kind of evidence-based, where does the evidence lead, without having any sort of particular agenda. So John Robinson, who wrote The Priority of John, he thought that all the Gospels were written before AD 70. So he favored an early composition, but he isn't saying that the Gospel of John was written earlier than the others. He is just saying that if you want to reconstruct a reasonable account of the historical Jesus, then the Gospel of John will be the sort of foundation, the pattern. If you read Mark, the life of Jesus seems to take maybe 18 months. And most of it, he is in Jerusalem once. He is in Galilee all the time. Same for the other, Matthew and Luke. But in the Gospel of John, it takes 3.5 years. That's where you have a sort of fuller sort of a time frame that accommodates the story the way we have thought it had to be. And Jesus is in Jerusalem over and over. He is going up, he's going down, back and forth, and this again has been a challenge, because you are right that it used to be thought that it was mostly symbolic, it was esoteric, it was otherworldly, But when you look at it, you see the claims for specificity of dates, of people, of names, people, individuals that are named, and it is risky to name individuals because you could be wrong, So he's you're taking a chance. So all of these features in the Gospel of John that used to be seen as more sort of literary embellishments, attempts to achieve verisimilitude, are now in the new revised paradigm seen as very much very much merited by the evidence. This has also been boosted by New Testament archaeology that has been done by J.H. Charlesworth and Urban von Walde, who teaches in Chicago. And these people have they have been working their way painstakingly through the years. And it has been, I have attended Gospel of John sessions of the Society of Biblical Literature because I am so intrigued by this. And it has been, like the older generation who used to think about the gospel the way you were taught. It has been, oh no, just having to kind of return to a very different sense of what sort of status this gospel should have. So yes, if you picked up that there is a change here, then surely that's the case.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. No, I remember even perhaps somebody said that things like the light and dark contrast maybe had to do with a specific Christian sect, perhaps Gnostic or something like that they would. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while, but they even went that far as to say that that the Gospel of John was based on schismatic groups within Christianity.
Yes, the sectarian group, and yes, a Gnostic influence. Definitely, that used to be the case, but that has been challenged because all the concepts, the logos, everything can be explained much better by Old Testament and Hebraic antecedent than by Gnostic influences. So Craig Keener, who's written a 2-volume commentary on John, he says that the logos, the enfleshed or embodied logos, the word became flesh. That is the Torah that becomes flesh. So you have embodied Torah.
Interesting.
In the logos concept, and you have a Hebrew or Old Testament antecedent for those conceptions.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Dr. Ray, ask you to unmute. Can you tell us
Hi.
where you are today and what you'd like to say?
Oh, so I'm in New York today, and my question, it might not be one that you want to ask because I think you indicated you want to kind of save it for another day, but I want to know who Berkeley believed was the disciple who Jesus loved, or Brockman wanted to.
I'm not sure. Could I didn't quite get the question. Could let's see, Gina, could you repeat it? Could you say what? Because the sound was a little unclear.
I think she's asking if you can say who is the disciple that Jesus loved. Is that right?
Yeah, I have a few. Shall I? I can share a slide or two for that, but let me not do it. Let's just say that in the gospel itself, there seems to be a list of names at the end from which you have to pick the beloved disciple. If you think that the beloved disciple was one of the official disciples of Jesus, there is a list of 12 earlier in the gospel, and there is a list of 7 in chapter 21, the people who were with him at the lake at the end. And so you have 7 candidates there, but some people, Johannine scholars, will not limit themselves. But one of the candidates, these are serious proposals. candidates who are not John, the son of Zebedee. And one of them is Nathaniel, one of them is Lazarus, one of them is Richard Baucham's candidate is John the Elder, another John who isn't John the son of Zebedee. And so there are all kinds of plot constructs there for the seeing whether this beloved disciple is John the son of Zebedee. Now, if you limit yourself to that list of 7 named people, 5 of them are named, 2 of them are unnamed. But if you limited yourself to that list of 7 people who are disciples, then it's going to be quite hard to beat the case for John, the son of Zebedee. But I don't want to deprive you of the joy and fun and challenge of exploring the case for the other candidates for the beloved disciple. Anyway, how in the world could you? I mean, why does the text give us that kind of figure? The beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved, and why has such a way of talking about that person emerged and made it into the text itself to such an extent that it has 5 times?
Does that answer your question? I hope so. I'm going to move on to Clarence and ask you to unmute, please. And I'm noting that Clarence is the only one who has his hand raised. So give me a break here, guys. Let's hear your thoughts. Go ahead, Clarence.
Yes, thank you, Gina. And thanks, Doctor, for the good presentation, wonderful presentation. My question is quite elementary, but let me state it anyway. Wouldn't it be more logical to accept the synoptic agreements as being more authentic in presenting the Jesus story than the Johannine presentation? To me, if 3 people are saying one thing and one person comes with a slightly different story, then logic would say that we would side with the 3 people. Elementary, yes, but it seems to me to be logical. What do you think?
Well, the 2 Gospels that are most explicit in claiming eyewitness testimony, of course, the Gospel of John does that much more than the others because you have that figure. And the Gospel of John also talks about that Jesus commissioned 12 disciples who had been with him from the beginning. So there is a beginning element there too. And these are people who are singled out in the story as very privileged and having close relations with Jesus. And one of them is a standout figure who is present in these pivotal moments at the Last Supper, at the cross, at the resurrection, and 2 scenes at the lake. So you can say the others. So the Gospel of Luke, of course, is also claiming eyewitness testimony, but not first-hand eyewitness. Luke has talked to people who were the best sources, and is quite explicit about or acknowledging that he was not one of the disciples. And for the other 2 Gospels, Mark and Matthew, we can infer that they are eyewitness accounts, but there is no claim of authorship. The authors of those 2 Gospels are not identified to us. So, but your point has merit. So, in fact, that has been the consensus. And now we have the Gospel of John in some ways vying for pride of place as the source of the about the historical Jesus and a Johannine priority, as it were, rather than a Markan priority. And I think it is quite, that shift has implications. So
Uh,
I don't want to say anything that invalidates the point that you make. It's logical, but it is not an argument that stands alone anymore. You have to complement it by new insights and new claims about the Gospel of John.
yes, I hear you, Doctor. But let me say this, New Testament archaeology notwithstanding, I say that Luke tells us that he researched the matter. He may not have been an eyewitness, but when somebody takes the time to go here and there and all over the place, asking questions of people who were eyewitnesses and who very likely would have had some particular story that an ordinary disciple not being present at the time wouldn't have had, I think we ought to give him some credit. And it seems to me that adds to the authenticity of the synoptic presentation.
Yeah, fine. No, I don't think I will say more. I accept that point, and then let's see what happens when we'll see where the chips fall in relation to it. This new book that is coming out that Mark Goodacre has recommended or written the foreword for, coming out next year, about that is more explicit about relating or sort of weighing the relationship between the synoptics and the Gospel of John. But certainly you are right that until recently it was seen as though the synoptic account was a more reliable source for a reconstruction of the life of the historical Jesus. But that is not the message that Johannine scholars are giving us right now. There is a change.
Okay. Excuse me, one last question, Doctor. I'm no longer in the classroom, and I, frankly, right now or these days, I'm leaning more toward science than the synoptic and gospel story. Okay? That's where I am right now. But let me ask this question. What has happened to the idea of, how did they call it, Kel or QL, being an authentic or a presumably first presentation of the Jesus story? What has happened to that? Is that idea thrown out altogether, or is it still current?
I personally think that it is it's likely to be fall more and more by the wayside. I mentioned
Okay.
that book by Mark Goodacre from 2002 about the Q source and where he basically picks it apart and says that everything that has been attributed to Q can be explained other ways, and that book has gotten very positive reviews by some of the leading people in New Testament scholarship. So it was always only a hypothesis, that it seemed like one wanted to use that to explain some of these both differences and similarities. Now, I tried in my presentation to say that this notion of indebtedness to Mark, from Mark to Matthew, from Mark to Luke, from a hypothetical Q source, as indebtedness from one written gospel to another written gospel could be explained by a different route, and that is the route by Birger Gerhardsson, the memory and manuscript route, that the oral tradition, the oral transmission was so robust that some of these similarities can be explained by the wide diffusion of a reliable oral tradition, and so not only by way of manuscripts, but so I think that supplements it, and I think that also has a explanatory power about what these differ.
Okay, thanks for a stirring presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarence. I'm going to go to Doug and Teresa in Oregon and ask you to, you have already unmuted. Go ahead. Give us your thoughts.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Dr. Tonstad. I've read a little bit of yours, as well as others, and I'm very unscholarly, but my observation of some of the tension between the Gospels and those who are scholarly in the Gospels, I think has led me to a conclusion which I'm interested in your thoughts on. I think it mirrors in some ways, the ideas that you have, or at least you've explained, about the community, referring to the Johannine community. And I guess that's one of the things that I wound up with is I may not know, I may not be able to ascertain, I may not even be able to understand all the scholarly thoughts. But in the end, I think maybe what seems to be most important is how will I live? How will it affect me? How will it affect the way that I relate to others around me? And there's a part of the Johannine community, as I understand John, that is helpful to me because it's kind of, I guess, in my mind, visionary, community oriented. But yet there's a part of the synoptics that very much resonates with me, which is built around how do I relate to others in the social sense, the social justice sense in particular, where I see the synoptic gospels are very different than John, and it appears to me in how they relate to what's going on around them in society. And so I find that to me to be very instructive, and I'd be appreciative of your thoughts on that. And then two other things that as soon as I knew your presentation was on this topic, I had to pull out a book, a 30-year-old book that fortunately I didn't buy 30 years ago, called The Five Gospels. And I'm curious as to your take on the very after canonization discovery of the book of writings of Thomas, and how that may or may not relate to Q, and how that may or may not be fit into sort of the source idea of some of what Q originally postulated, and maybe fits into that.
Well, so why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in the canon? The Gospel of Thomas is probably, of the so-called Gnostic Gospels, it is probably the one that could just get at least make it to the finals of the Gnostic apocryphal stories about Jesus. So why didn't Thomas make it? Why? And there is a huge, of course, the scholarship of the Gnostic Gospels. There is a group of people who are very fond of the Gospel of Thomas. But I agree with a very crude comment by a recently deceased scholar, and I think he was from New Zealand or Australia, Eric Osborne, who says that the Gnostics lost because they couldn't think. They were a New Age, group, and the Gospel of Thomas simply didn't make it because it doesn't measure up. It in some ways, and this is my view, it fails self-evidently. But some people do not think so, and I'm sure the author of the book, The Five Gospels, think that the Gospel of Thomas has merit. So that view is out there, and Elaine Pagels, who is the leading scholar in the U.S. about the Gnostic Gospels, she's a very nice person and a very, very amazing scholar. So I'm not going to disparage her, but I think we are going to have to. I do not think there will be a five gospel account that will gain all that much traction. I think one has tried it out. It has not succeeded.
Is it your view that was discovered after canonization, or was it known about before canonization? I guess that's what I see as the problem.
It depends on how you. It also depends on how you think about canonization. If you think that canonization is something that was done by a committee of whoever they were, a kind of ecclesial canonization. But if you then you get, that is a kind of Catholic view that the church decided what should be the Bible, and that was done by an authoritative body. But if you think that the choice of books that made it into the canon is something that is kind of intrinsic to the books themselves, their quality, that it was their self-evident quality that got them to be canonized, and not some church council. Yes, it was formalized maybe by some church council, but it wasn't. That's not how the canonization actually works. The Protestant view is different. It is more the quality of the work, and on that score, the Gospel of Thomas did not make it. So I think there is a kind of deceptive similarity between some of the language in the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas, but it is deceptive because the sort of tendency to be esoteric, tendency to be otherworldly in the Gospel of Thomas is real. But in the Gospel of John, it is just an appearance. It appears to be that way, but when you test it, you see that it is in some ways more earthy than any of the others. The two disciples, they were running to the tomb. The other guy ran faster. He came there first, huffing and puffing. Then the other guy came. These are earthy stories, and there is nothing quite as earthy as that of the accounts of the other gospels. They seem to stand a little more removed from what actually happens. But in Gospel of John, you can hear John and Peter breathing.
Thank you.
I'm going to go to Art Clem. Art, you've already unmuted, so take it away.
Yes, I'm a little puzzled by the possibility of John Priority. I'll have to read one of those books. But when I read the Gospels, it seems to me that the Gospel of John is telling a different story almost than the Synoptics. Can you imagine finding in the Gospel of John something like what we find in Matthew, where Jesus says, there was no man born of woman that is greater than John the Baptist. Well, was Jesus born of a woman or not? The Gospel of John would never say something like that. And in Mark, when the one man says, "Good master, good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Why are you calling me good? No one is good but God." John wouldn't say that. John would say, "Yeah, call me good because I am God too." But the Synoptics don't use that kind of kind of language at all. So isn't it true that in most every other area of our existence, that the farther we get removed from the story, the greater the stories are about the person who has passed, perhaps been martyred, perhaps been killed, that they become more sainted, not less, and particularly in a primitive society, I would think. Just wanted your thoughts on that. Oh,
Before
one
you
other.
answer-
I'm sorry. I was going to say something else. I forgot. Excuse me. My career has been, and it's been over 47 years now, has been in the law. And I've tried a lot of cases before judges and juries. And now I sit as a judge and I listen to, I read declarations primarily under oath from people and make decisions based on that. And I can tell you that if I get 3 declarations, 3 affidavits under oath from somebody saying this is how it was, and then a 4th person says, no, that isn't the way it was, unless there's a good reason to doubt the 3, I'm probably going to go with the 3. And the same thing is true when I tried cases to judges or juries. And the fact that somebody wrote a better affidavit is more earthy, probably isn't going to carry it for me. Okay, those are my thoughts. I'll be interested in yours.
So well, I'm happy to know about your background, and then I will say about the Gospel of John that is actually been seen as a gospel that is constructed as a lawsuit. There is a wonderful book by Andrew Lincoln called Truth on Trial, and the subtitle is The Lawsuit Motif in the Fourth Gospel. And Andrew Lincoln shows how there is a kind of an issue that is supposed, coming before the law, the jury that will give the verdict. And sometimes the jury is in the text itself, but most of the time it is the reader of the gospel that is doing jury duty in sort of processing the lawsuit connotation of this gospel. So that is a major thing. Of course, there is a trial too in the gospel, in Jesus tried first before the Sanhedrin and then tried before the Pilate, and the lawsuit playing out in the presence of Pilate is a much more developed than in any other story. And yes, you might say that there is not did you say that, or someone else said that there is a kind of social consciousness in the synoptics that seems lacking in the Gospel of John? But who knows? Because in Jesus' trial before Pilate, he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, am I servant?" So the sort of distancing Jesus from the way power is exercised in this world is very strong in the Gospel of John. Now, here is the most important thing I can say in relation to what you said. Doesn't Jesus kind of grow and become more legendary and more sort of built up to be more certainly divine in the fourth gospel? That the fourth gospel has an explicit higher Christology than the others. And maybe so, maybe it does. But the Christology of the Gospel of John is always subservient to theology. So many people read the Christology of John to make it seem like it is an end in itself. It is to be Jesus. And I looked at the Sabbath school lessons, and I think they make that mistake, that they tend to see, believing in Jesus is the big thing. But believing in Jesus is only a stepping stone to believing that God is like Jesus. He who has seen me has seen the Father. It's a huge claim to say that, but it is seeing the Father that is the main point. It is not seeing Jesus. And now let me quote from memory John chapter 10, verses 37 and 38. If I do not do the works of my Father, then do not believe me. But if I do them, believe the works, even if you don't believe in me. So here, Jesus is offering a kind of plan B for those who are sort of, think that the Christological claim is too robust, too expansive, too big. He is saying that I'm giving you the option of taking me out of the picture if only you will believe that the works I did were the works of the Father. So the way Christology is nuanced in the Gospel of John, and the way Christology is a servant of theology, is consciously, is structurally, conceptually a very developed aspect or characteristic of the gospel. So I think there is merit to your point, to your impression that the gospel is, the legend built, and the legend got bigger and bigger and so on, and 50 years of legend building, then you have a kind of esoteric figure, but the gospel is quite good at correcting those kinds of impressions, and sort of making sure that we do not get off on the wrong path there. Let me say it again. The high Christology of the Gospel of John is always and consciously and explicitly a servant of that book's theology.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Randy, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I got a couple of thoughts, and some of them are maybe kind of moving back a little bit in the conversation. So when we look at John seems to bring some probably Greek philosophical elements that the other three books don't seem to have, which I find a little bit curious in the conversation, which would tend to cause, so this is going back to kind of authorship. Would a first century Jewish peasant really be that in tune with some of the kind of Greekish leaning things that emanate from the growing story, like you just referred? That's kind of my first thought, and then and I really want to hear your perspective on that. And then the other one, about the Johannine community. There are things that I've come across lately, some reading that I've done, that there is a substantial movement in New Testament scholarship that kind of discounts the actual that there was an actual community that could be identified. So is there any archaeological evidence that would cause us to really go, oh yeah, there was actually the Johannine community? Just curious.
Yeah, first about the sort of Greek influence. So that used to be thought to have some merit before, but it's quite easy to say that is not a very strong theory. So the Word was with God, and the Word was in the beginning with God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The notion of the revealer becoming flesh, and that flesh is redeemed, by God assuming flesh, that is as anti-Greek as you can possibly get. you can, because flesh is the problem in the Greek paradigm, certainly in the Platonic sense, but in the Gospel of John, flesh is not a problem. It is God who enters into the human condition as flesh. And one of the most wonderful Johannine scholars I know of her name is Gail O'Day, and she died a few years ago. She's just a lovely, lovely person. She was also a president of the Society of Biblical Literature, and she has written the best I have seen of the way John plays on flesh and on the incarnation. She says that what saves in the Gospel of John is not the death of Jesus, it is the incarnation. It is the coming into flesh of this figure in John. So those conceptions seem to me to be fatal to a kind of Greek conceptions. And then about the Johannine community, is there an evidence for it? Is there external evidence? Is it true that if it was John, the son of Zebedee, or if it was John the elder, the candidate that Richard Bachman has, and that these figures somehow took up residence near Ephesus, and that there was an actual community there? Those are theories. But there is evidence of an aspiration to build a community inside the text. The community aspect is there, that they may be one. That they may be one, I and you in me, that they may be one in us, that the Lord, that the world may know that you have sent me. So the communal or community aspect is part of the theology of the Gospel of John. Maybe it is also part of the sociology of that gospel, and that is part of the Johannine community thesis. So you heard me say that I believe more that there was a community, but I do not believe in the two-level hypothesis, the way it is, the way it was promoted by J. L. Martin.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Jack Hain and ask him to unmute. Thank you. Go ahead. And where are you today, Jack? And can you tell us what you're thinking about?
Well, I'd like to tell Sigve first that I'm just 1 week away from Norway. I was on the ferry boat going up the coast from Bergen to Kirkenes, and my admiration for your home country has been increased by the experience. I'd like to ask and or affirm or contradict what I was surprised to learn, and that is that the earliest record of Jesus is not in any of the Gospels, but the Jesus story that was written earliest and closest to the events is in the epistles of Paul, that Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians talk about the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ were actually historically the first ones written and recorded, and are the most authentic if we're looking for close to the events, maybe within 20 years of when they happened.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that is a very important point. I think that the first that Paul preached the gospel, the gospel story was oral first, and then the oldest written documents are the letters of Paul, and gospels could be seen then as a consequence of Paul's mission. But But Paul never claims to have experienced Jesus firsthand, except for this encounter. He does have mystical encounters. He had the encounter on the Damascus Road, but earthly, historical Jesus did not have an encounter with Paul. The Gospel of John claims that the beloved disciple was leaning on his breast at the supper, and that he was a go-between, and he was present at all the crucial points. And does it tell us? Does it make those claims in a way that makes it seem maybe so? Maybe so. That it does certainly make those claims. That and then if I were to add one more thing about John and Paul, it would be that contemporary Pauline scholarship has made Paul into a figure who is much closer to Johannine theology than used to be the case. Paul has a more Johannine voice. Did you hear me? I said that. Thank you for your kind words about Norway.
Well, it supports to me the idea that John is not a late development and a sort of historical hagiography of Jesus, but actually whatever Paul wrote very close to the event from the community he knew within 20 years of the crucifixion, and whenever John was written, they agree very much. The theology is the same.
I had a couple questions I would like to ask. One is, when you think about people who are your acquaintances or people who are your friends, and then you may have one person who is your best friend, who is your confidant, do they have a different understanding of the person than those who are mere acquaintances or disciples or friends? And is that why John is described as the one who is beloved by Jesus? Is this like Jesus's best friend? He knows the scoop, and that's why his gospel may have more credibility. And my second question was something that Jack is leaning on here. Even though John was written, was the last of the gospels written by common understanding, is it possible, and you would know the answer to this, that the Johannian community was already basing their beliefs on this story that John was telling before he put it in writing, that would give it some credibility, even though the actual gospel was written later in time?
I think both of your thoughts are plausible. Yeah, so it is remarkable to have a figure called the beloved disciple. Did Jesus, differentiate it, or can you infer that he was very close to Jesus? At the cross there is the beloved disciple and 3 or 4 women. And John is very fond of the women, and is the great place to go if you want to make an argument for women's ordination, But and then you have the way this figure is also important or beloved by the community. So I think one has to add that beloved by Jesus and beloved by the community, and now he is about to die. Jesus did not say that this person wouldn't die. He only said, the need to issue a denial that Jesus had said that he would come back before the beloved disciple died. You are having a window on a conversation taking place in the Johannine community at that point, aren't we? That Jesus didn't say that he would, he seems to be dying. Maybe he died already. So you have to say that Jesus didn't say that he would, if he is to live till I come, what is that to you? Follow you me. Anyway, I hope my comment made some sense.
Yes, thank you for that. Lauren, go ahead.
This has been a fascinating discussion. I thought I'd ask you about a different aspect of the Gospel of John, and that is the things that only John tells us, which I find very interesting. The first one that came to mind was, of course, the Adventist. The thing that's important to Seventh Adventists, only John tells us that Jesus washed the disciples' feet. The others don't tell us that. They tell us that he gave them bread and wine. And I've actually heard people of other denominations who don't do the foot washing say that's an indication it is less important than the other sacraments. But then there's a couple of my favorite stories. I love the story of the woman at the well, only told by John. And I love the story of Jesus turning water into wine, which is a great story and probably somewhat controversial if you really take it at its straightforward meaning. And then Lazarus, raising of Lazarus is only in John. But the one that probably stands out more than any other is John chapter 3. So early in Jesus' ministry is this event where he sits down and has a detailed conversation with Nicodemus and explains to him concepts of salvation. And you got to wonder here, this is a little puzzling in some ways. Who wrote all this down? Somebody explained in great detail this rather evangelical notion that's become so popular that here in America, Christians who go to football games do banners of it and unfurl it when the camera is looking at their part of the front row of the stadium. John 3:16. Does the specificity? And if you want to talk about very specific conversations that are recorded, you also have that whole discourse at the end, John 14 through 17. Does the specificity of these sermons, perhaps, could they have been sermons? Tell us anything additional, the reasons that John decided that whoever wrote John decided to record these events that are not recorded anywhere else. What does it tell us about who the author of John was? So I guess my first thought, and you probably have already been thinking this, is he was very clear about Jesus being divine in ways that probably the others weren't. But it certainly is very pointed the way he comes out, particularly in the Nicodemus passage, with what it takes to be saved. Tell me a little bit about what you think about these things that are only said by John, but nobody else.
Well, I think you just mentioned a host of examples of why these are examples that Richard Bauckham will use to build the case for eyewitness testimony in John. There seems to be such an immediacy to it. There was a man, Nicodemus, he came by night,
Yeah.
and he goes to this Samaritan woman and sits down and talks. The sort of the immediacy of it, the exchanges, it's so unique. And yet, and it's also that they, yes, Nicodemus is an important person in Israel, but the woman at the well isn't, so there is all kinds of, things about that. But those examples are examples that you could say, well, they are embellishments, inventions. Or you can say they are eyewitness testimony.
Okay.
And according to the gospel, since the gospel makes so much of this eyewitness claim, then we have to send a case to Art Klim, and he has to judge, to pass judgment on it and see, does it pass muster as eyewitness testimony, or is this a witness that made up all kinds of stuff? And I'm sure you've had people in your courtroom that made stuff up. It's the beloved disciples, the voice that did sort of make up stuff. So the pendulum has swung. The pendulum has swung in very clearly. But let's see. I wonder if I can still share my screen. So I will just, if I could, I want to share.
You still can, yes.
Let me see.
And by the way, I've known Art Clem for 50 years, and I don't think I want him to adjudicate this case.
Let's see. Yeah. So I want to just go, let's see. I want to do my timeline. Maybe that I should have done that. So the timeline of the story in John. So there is a memory of the initial commission, because there is a huge, much more detailed account in John that the first disciples of Jesus were disciples of John the Baptist before. There is much more on that. So John the Baptist story is huge in the Gospel of John, bigger than in the other Gospels. So it takes us to a very early point in the account. Then there are all these specific mentions where the beloved disciple is present at these pivotal events. And then there is the farewell scene, memory of the meeting by the lake, and a new commission. And then the years go by, and the beloved disciple, who was a young man in the original story, is now an old man, and the rumor spreads in the community that this type of disciple would not die. But Jesus had not said that he wouldn't die. He had only said, I want him to live till I come. What is that to you? Follow you me. So here, I think you have a plausible timeline for the way the story is put together. And yes, it has incubated. And yes, the beloved disciple may have developed, or in some ways, developed some themes more than they were developed at the time. That there is the theology of the Gospel of John is not only the theology of Jesus, it's also the theology of the beloved disciple. There is a homogeneity to the talk when Jesus talks, and when John the Baptist talks, and when the narrator in the Gospel talks, they talk the same way. There is a homogenization of the language in a way that shows, I think, the passage of time. So now I want to just show you one more thing. This is about the beloved disciple. So I have a chapter. This is just an aside, but not totally irrelevant. So at St. Andrews, some years ago, there was a conference on the theology of the Gospel of John. It was in 2006, and I had just finished my studies, but I had made a proposal to present a paper there to this conference, and this conference attracted scholars of the best kind. Every big name in the Bishop of Canterbury and Rowan Williams was there, and Martin Hengel was there, and all the big names in Johannine studies were there, and lowly me got to present the paper. And I presented under the title, The Father of Lies, the Mother of Lies, and the Death of Jesus. And my paper was also accepted for inclusion in this book, the Gospel of John, and Christian theology. So I am Jürgen Moltmann has a chapter there too. So here, lucky me. So here is someone who's bought the book on Amazon. He said that there are some fantastic articles with rich and meaningful commentary on the issues. Tonstad's article was incredible, and his perspective on the necessity of the cross was not only intellectually stimulating, but very compelling and moving. I would buy this volume for the Tonstad article alone. I am not telling you this to sort of build my reputation. I want to just say that these are some perceptions I have had of the qualities in this gospel and its themes. So here is one more. So this is from Joanne Brandt's commentary on the Gospel of John and the Paideia series. I have written the Paideia volume on Revelation. So here is what she says about the meaning of the Gospel of John, or what she and I say. The problem that many theologians have with setting Jesus' reference to the ruler of this world within the context of a cosmic battle is that this grants too much salvific import to the crucifixion and not enough to the revelation of the truth, because she, like me, believes that revelation is a very important theme in the Gospel of John. This does not mean that the ruler of this world cannot be a reference to Satan. In John, Satan is the father of lies. Jesus' victory, however, lies not in a cosmic battle, but in the revelation that he dies an honorable death, putting to rest the lie that crucifixion is humiliation. As Sigve Tonstad concludes, Jesus' claim to triumph is theodicy, not soteriology. And do I think that she has done me a favor by saying that? Of course I do. But I do think that here is one other person who actually reads the Gospel of John the way it seems to me it should be read, and the way I have explored it in my limited way. Let's see now. There you go. Yeah.
You're very good, and boy, I'm proud of you. I'm proud to know you. Thank you. As long as I'm on here, I'm going to take this moment. I usually do this about this time, Sigve. I announce who's going to be talking next week. And as you all know, I've told you before, it's very important to us at Adventist Today that we not just cycle through the great scholars that we are aware of in the church, but that we introduce new scholars. And I want to introduce you all to Tammy Weiss. Tammy Weiss is studying her PhD at St. Andrews. Tammy, I've unmuted you here. If you could tell us what you are going to be talking to us about next week.
Thank you. I'm quite excited about next week. I am presenting some of my research on sin and atonement, and just real excited. And I kind of want to get some feedback from ordinary, regular people and not just theologians. And so I need y'all's help, helping me think through the stuff that I'm learning.
Oh, lovely. And we are ordinary and regular. You can be sure of that. And we'll be looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.
This is lovely. I love it when we can introduce a new scholar to our group and get them talking about what's interesting to them. We have not done a lot of systematic theology, so this should be very interesting. We've done a lot of history. We do some pastoral topics. We do some sort of church and sociology sort of topics, but this will be challenging to us. Tammy, thank you so much for being willing. Thank you so much for being willing to do this for us.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and okay, that's enough for me. Just wanted to let you know, the week after that, we have Horace Alexander, who's going to be talking to us about the Bible as literature, analyzing the stories of the Bible and and how people who are doing literary analysis do that. And after that, we have Courtney Ray, who is a regular member of our class here, Dr. Courtney Ray. And, I haven't asked Courtney yet what she's talking about, but we'll get that later on. Looking forward to hearing from her. She's already left for today. Thank you, Dr. Tonstad. We have a few more hands here, and I think we'll probably have to get through those. I think I've unmuted Ed Reifsnyder, Gina, already. So we can
go
go
ahead,
on.
Ed.
Well, first of all, Tammy Weiss is a friend, and I am so very proud of her. She finished an entire career in elementary education. And when she retired, she decided that she wanted to do theology. She's now got a couple of master's degrees and is working on her doctorate at University of St. Andrews. And the reason she did it, as I understand it, is that she wasn't happy with all the theories of atonement that have been presented over the years, and she's working on some fresh ideas. And so this should be very interesting. Dr. Tonstad, I noted that 5 times you referred to John referring, we think, to himself as the beloved disciple. And I got to wondering about that. It's an interesting thing. John could have been saying, I felt so very loved by Jesus that I consider myself beloved. And every one of the other disciples could have felt the same way. They might have felt beloved also because of their relationship with Jesus. We naturally think that if he says he was the beloved disciples, that he had preference in the eyes of Jesus. And I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if there's any information available that attributes that sentiment to Jesus relative to John. I'm just curious about that because maybe I feel beloved by Jesus. Maybe I could write that I'm the beloved one because of Jesus' whole sacrifice and his life and so forth. Do you have any insights into that, whether John was just expressing his emotions, his gratitude, or whether there was a special relationship with Jesus that was two-way?
Yeah, so I welcome your question. I think it is a very good question, and it has potential to clarify something. So on one of my panels, I had that in the story in the Gospel of John at the ending, there is a he and a we and an I. There is a he, that's the beloved disciple. There is a we represented that we might infer is the community of the beloved disciple. And there is an I voice, and I, there's so many things about we could say about Jesus, and so the I voice comes in there. So there is we don't really need to say that the beloved disciple called himself that. But the I voice, the narrator in the story, calls him that. So does he do that because he knows that there was a special relationship with Jesus, and the beloved disciple had in some ways shown that, shared that, but we do not need to say that the beloved disciple told the others that I was a beloved disciple. It is the narrator's voice who uses that. The disciple whom Jesus loved, mentioned 5 times in this gospel by the I voice, and the I voice is not the I voice is not the voice of it's not the beloved disciple himself. The I in the Gospel of John at the ending is talks about the beloved disciple, but is different from him. So I just hope that clarifies it a little. It is very intriguing that such a figure is there, and the claim for eyewitness testimony rests on the witness of the beloved disciple. But the term, the beloved disciple, is in some ways we could attribute or ascribe to the narrator who tells us the story, who kind of signs off on a story that he ascribes to the beloved disciple. So the I and the we and the he.
Thank you for that. I'm going to jump over to Carmen since we haven't heard from her yet, and then I'll go to Doug and Teresa, and then we'll finish up with Clarence. So Carmen, I tried to get you to unmute, but my mouse just jumped. Go for it. Go ahead.
Dr. Tonstad, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. You got me thinking when, not especially, I should say, I'm just saying most recently when you quoted John 10. And I'm going to put in the chat another part of John 10. This is the NRSVUE, which is, according to my understanding, the most scholarly recent version. Do you agree with them favoring in verse 8, all who came before me are thieves and bandits? And what was Jesus referring to according to what you have studied?
Well, I have seen that text too, and it's and so that the whole context of that chapter is it has a kind of meditating chapter there. Jesus is walking, and it's winter, and he's walking out there somewhere where it's cold, and then he talks. Yes, there is a primary audience there, but there is also in some ways a to whom it may concern feel to some of those statements. That does he talk to the immediate audience, or is this a kind of more Johannine voice here? I don't have a short answer for it. I think there is something that could be similar in the encounter with Nicodemus. In the Nicodemus encounter, it's very concrete at the beginning, an interaction, a conversation, and then Nicodemus disappears. He sort of vanishes. And Jesus continues talking, God so loved the world that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. That is said in the context of a conversation with Nicodemus, but it has a to whom it may concern feel to it, where the initial audience seems to have vanished into the background. And I wonder if that could be a little bit the case here too, in that sheep and the gate, and claim that all who came before me are thieves and bandits. I just think you gave us a good reason to continue reading the gospel.
Pretty fascinating. Thanks.
Thanks, Carmen. I'm going to go to Doug, unless it's Teresa who has thoughts. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for a second shot at this. I realized, Dr. Tonstad, after my first conversation with you, I had to go back and look up something, and I realized we might have been talking about two different things, and I'm not sure, so I wanted to make sure I interpreted correctly your response. I had to look it up, and apparently there's and I have read this, an infancy gospel of Thomas, which is totally fantastical. It's totally entertainment, totally non-credible. And then there's the Coptic gospel of Thomas that I understand was discovered in its entirety in 1945 in someplace that I can't pronounce. And I want yes. And so I wanted to make sure that your comments were intended to apply to that Coptic gospel, the 114 sayings that this book of 76 scholars put together. So just wanted to make sure of that.
Yeah, no, but I was referring to that. I was referring to the Gospel of Thomas that is most, highly regarded and seems in some ways to be the closest to the idiom in the canonical Gospels.
Yeah. Okay.
I was referring to that.
Okay. All right. Then the other comment, just as a sort of an observation on my part, is my brother and I are only 4.5 years to get apart in age, but his observation about my parents and the things that we both experienced are so different that it helps me understand. Excuse me. Helps me understand how there's a Catholic church just down the street. Excuse me. It's St. Mark's. And there's another one a little further away, St. John's. And in my view, I understand how communities can create their own narrative and experience things that are common. The actual experience is common, but their interpretation of them are very different based on their own life experiences, the situation they're in. And so to me, I have to give space to that and still believe that what I experienced was true and what my brother says he experienced was true, but they're only true to each of us. And I don't necessarily have to prove that before Art Clem or anybody else. So I guess that's my observation. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to go to Claire. Go ahead.
I like that, so let's try this one with Art. If your witnesses come in and they say the same thing verbatim, they all say exactly the same thing, same words, same sequence, then you might say in court that you three guys have talked to each other. You are not three different witnesses. You have colluded. You have done something behind, to build a story, you might say. And the difference, you will find those witnesses more authentic if they are not exactly the same. And maybe that also works. That is how I read Richard Burridge's book, Four Gospels, One Jesus.
Well, that's true if they said exactly the same thing, but I expect them to agree on the greater story. And if one says Jesus said, "Why are you calling me good? There isn't anybody good but God," and then another witness comes in and says, "Jesus was constantly telling us he was God." And that's not the same. That story is so jarringly different. So, but I'm a skeptic, so that's where I come from.
I'll meet you in the back room after.
Thank you, Art. Clarence, go ahead. Give us your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks again, Dr. Townsend, for the very stimulating presentation. I've been thinking, after reading John chapter 10, 37, 38, is it? Or 36, 37. If we may go to God by simply looking at the works of Jesus, could that be a bypassing of the person of Jesus to get to God? In other words, may an animist get to God without the person of Jesus? Would that be a salvific experience? Would that be a genuine experience that we could honor? Well, that we could honor, maybe it's not our business, but it's God's business, but that we would approve of in our human sphere. And secondly, I'd like to know, I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or the Father is in me as I am in the Father. what exactly are we to understand by these words?
Yeah, so in life, when someone uses a negation, a negative, if this or not that, and so on, those negatives, those negations, they sift options. They give more precision to us. So when Jesus says, "If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do them, believe the works, even if you don't believe in me." He is not saying nothing. He is using, there are two negatives there, two what we in medicine would call pertinent negatives, that helps you narrow the options. So all I'm saying there is that for the Gospel of John, the high Christological claims are not the end point. It is not the affirmation of the high Christology that is most important to Jesus. It is the theological meaning of Jesus. And yes, you probably cannot separate that from the high Christology, but there is a hypothetical offered there. If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. If I do them, but if I do them, believe the works, even if you don't believe in me. I think this is an excellent place to do interreligious dialogue. So you may find Jesus a stumbling block, but the picture of God, theology, that is the priority of the Gospel of John, can continue, without insisting on only making everything subservient to Christology. So I have written a chapter to a friend of mine who has worked among Muslims about that text, and I just think that's an important text to make the theology more important than the Christology.